Welcome back. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett said yesterday she did not believe the country was in a constitutional crisis, despite the Trump administration openly naming and shaming judges assigned to its legal cases. The justice made that comment during an interview last night in New York City to promote her new book. Barrett said, quote, "I don't know what a constitutional crisis would look like. I don't think that we are currently in a constitutional crisis. However, I think our country remains committed to the rule of law. I think we have functioning courts." Barrett, a Trump appointee and member of the court's 6 conservative justice majority, said there would be a constitutional crisis if the rule of law crumbled, but that the U.S. has not gotten to that point. That's just one of the many headlines that we've been tracking to end the week. Joining us now, Annalise Keller. She's a former communications director for Republican Senator Cory Gardner. Also with us, John McCarthy. He's the former senior advisor for political engagement to President Biden. So happy to have both of you here. We've had a swirling week of news, but I think no story has been more captivating than the one on Capitol Hill, where the Epstein survivors spoke with lawmakers on the foot of the Capitol, urging lawmakers to sign on to one vehicle for transparency on the issue. Annalise, I'll go to you first on this. I mean, what do you think the impact is for Republican members who recognize that the politics of this are really tough because they are both the ones that pushed for transparency, but also Trump now very much does not want these documents released in the way he said he would release them. So what does this do when advocates and survivors are literally saying this would help us heal? Does that change anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very good to hear from the survivors and the victims. Those are voices that really haven't been heard up until this point. And it does put Republicans in a difficult spot. I think you saw Speaker Mike Johnson bring a sort of symbolic resolution to the House, to the House of Representatives this week. And I think that he did that because he was hearing internally a cry from Republicans who needed to be able to be on the record to vote, even if it's, you know, more of a symbolic vote to say that they want to increase transparency and to continue to uncover what's going on with Epstein. With respect to the discharge petition, there have been so far about 4 Republicans who've signed on to it. Of course, they need 6. It's very different to be one of those 4 people who sign on to the discharge petition. It's a very different proposition to be the 218th Republican to trigger that vote. So I am a little bit skeptical that that goes anywhere.
Yeah, and I think we've sort of seen momentum rise and then fall a little bit as some of the members that we initially thought on the Republican side might get on board for that discharge petition are definitely lying in wait or even saying that they prefer to go the oversight committee route, which I reported last night is going to see some unredacted files from the Epstein estate that could include that birthday book that allegedly includes a letter from President Trump, though he's denied that he ever wrote that. But John, you're a former House guy. I mean, what do you see in the dynamics here as Democrats come back to town saying their focus is still on affordability, and yet this is something that they've made a lot of hay about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how you couldn't watch that press conference and feel moved by the voices of those women. I mean, that took a lot of courage to be able to stand up there and speak up and speak out. And it's important to remember we've spent so much time talking about Jeffrey Epstein. But when I watched that, the thing that I realized is that this conversation really needs to be focused on those women and their stories and the reason that they're speaking out. And the only reason they're put in this position and that they have to put their personal credibility and their safety on the line is because congressional Republicans are not stepping up and they're not using their power of oversight here. You know, the politics on this are relatively complicated. Members just got back from the August recess. They're here, and what they've been hearing from their constituents in many cases is that either they ran on this in the first place and said they cared about transparency and were being dishonest, or that they're lying right now to cover up for Donald Trump.
I think that those are some of the dynamics that Republicans were hearing when you're at home. But I asked Congresswoman Debbie Dingell yesterday, is this the central issue that you're hearing about? And she said, yeah, it comes up, but affordability and safety are really important, too. She's, of course, in Michigan. But when you, John, as someone who was just at the DNC summer meeting, hear about the way that the chair there is saying that Democrats are bringing a pencil to a knife fight, that he's tired of that, and then we get into a period where Democrats are talking about leverage when it comes to a government shutdown, how do those different threads collide with that September 30th end of the month deadline of will the government shut down or won't it?
Well, there's a couple factors at play there. I think that the Democratic brand is in a bit of a crisis. One of the things that we're seeing time and time again is that our voters are telling us that they want to see us fighting and pushing back. And at the same time, they want to see that the Democratic Party comes back somewhere towards not just the middle, not just the center, but really kind of towards normalcy. So getting a Democratic Party that's back and recentered on economic messaging and talking about costs is going to be something that's really important. We've seen that in the New York mayoral primary, and we're seeing it in the elections that are coming up in New Jersey and Virginia. All of these elections are really focusing in on cost of living issues. So all of these distractions that tend to be happening in Washington have very little to do with what people are actually feeling in their everyday lives.
I do 100% think that affordability, whether it's around healthcare or housing or grocery prices, is going to end up being the seminal issue of the midterms. But Annalise, when we think about a government shutdown at the end of the month, this is always the battle that we were driving towards when Congress came back to town. What do you see in the way that Republicans are handling this? As Democrats say, we feel almost comfortable with holding our votes politically because the party in power is typically blamed for shutdowns. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who need to cobble the votes together. That's the Democratic view.
Yeah, this has been something, Allie, that you and I have been talking about for months now, because I think we all see this coming to a shutdown. That is where I feel like things are going to end up, at least, if not at the end of this month, maybe later in the year. And the person that I'm watching most closely is really Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. I think he is in the biggest bind here, because if Republicans put forward what's called kind of a clean CR, a spending measure that really just continues the Biden funding levels, I think that he's in a really difficult position because his base wants him to fight. They are itching for a shutdown, and he got absolutely shellacked in March when he provided the votes to keep the government open in the Senate, which, remember, you need 60 votes in the Senate. So while it can be a partisan exercise in the House, it has to include Democrats to keep that government open over in the Senate, and that is really where the rubber is going to hit the road.
And typically, I mean, you guys know this because you are Congress people, but every single time we cover one of these shutdown fights, it is usually a bipartisan effort because there are Republican members that just won't sign continuing resolutions that kicks this can down the road. And so Republicans always need Democrats to get on board with this. And that's why Democrats say, fine, we have a leverage point when it comes to health care, when it comes to oversight of the CDC, any number of issues, including troops being extended potentially in Washington, D.C. All of those issues are leverage points. And I think that, to something John said, when you talk about Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, he knows that pressure from the base about what it means to fight, to obstruct, to react in a way that feels a little bit more creative than just the typical way that this was handled in March, when Schumer sort of allowed Democrats to vote with Republicans to avoid a government shutdown. At that point, the thinking was, well, if we get into a shutdown, how do we get out of one? I don't know that we have a different answer to that question this time, but I do think in my reporting, Schumer's calculus has changed, and certainly House Democrats are right there along with them. It was a big panel to end the week. Annalise Keller and John McCarthy, I thank you both for joining us and wrapping it up for viewers.